One stormy night at the old Edgewood Manor, the neighbors thought they knew the man inside, Adrian Marlowe, a cold and fading king of industry. But behind those locked doors, he faced a battle no boardroom could prepare him for, a little girl's voice calling him bonus dad, and a ruthless brother determined to strip him of everything. Love, betrayal, and the weight of a legacy collided in a fight where the true question was never about money, but about what it really means to belong. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Adrian Marlowe pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him, the sound echoing through the wide hall like a hammer on hollow wood. Edgewood Manor stood proud on the edge of Forest Park, its high ceilings and polished marble floors designed to impress anyone who stepped inside. Tonight, though, the house felt like a stage after the play had ended, grand, silent, and stripped of warmth. He loosened the tie around his neck, dropping his leather briefcase onto a chair no one else ever used. The drive back from St. Hilaire Medical Center had been long and gray, Portland rain streaking the windshield as the doctor's words replayed in his mind. Stage 4. Nothing to bargain with, nothing to fight for, at least not in the way men like him were used to fighting. Adrian had spent his life building Marlowe Industries, commanding boardrooms, buying influence, carving his name into contracts and headlines. Yet standing here in the middle of his immaculate foyer, he felt like a ghost wandering through a museum curated in his honor. All this wealth, every chandelier, every imported rug. What good would it do when his body was quietly giving out? He moved through the dim corridors toward the study, his footsteps muffled against the Persian carpet. The staff had left for the evening, except for the part-time housekeeper, Serena Rios, who came twice a week. Sometimes her daughter trailed along, a little girl with wide eyes who left fingerprints on the glass doors. Adrian never said much to either of them. Distance was safer. At the end of the west wing sat the library, a room few people even knew existed. The door was always locked, key hanging on a chain under his shirt. Adrian slipped it into the lock and stepped inside. The smell of old leather and dust hit him instantly, wrapping around him like a memory. On the desk lay a slim black journal. He opened it, running his fingers over pages filled with restless handwriting, his thoughts, his fears, scribbled when the nights grew too long. He closed it again quickly, almost ashamed to have touched it. Secrets were easier to keep when they stayed on paper. Adrian lowered himself into the armchair by the window. Through the tall glass panes, he could see the city lights blinking faintly in the distance, life carrying on without him. The truth settled heavy in his chest. When he was gone, Edgewood Manor would echo even louder, and no one would remember who had once paced its halls. The storm rolled in before dusk, the kind that swallowed Portland in sheets of rain and wind sharp enough to shake the shutters. Edgewood Manor stood against it like an old ship creaking in rough seas, its halls rattling with drafts and echoes. Adrian Marlowe sat in his library, the only room where he allowed himself to breathe without a mask on. A fire burned low, throwing long, tired shadows across the shelves of books that hadn't been opened in years. He had planned to spend the night alone, as he always did, pen scratching across the journal that hid beneath his elbow. But then he heard it. Footsteps in the hall, light and quick, not belonging to any of his staff. When the door creaked open, Adrian's head snapped up. A small figure slipped inside, hair damp from the storm, eyes wide at the sight of rows and rows of books. Lydia, the housekeeper's little girl. What are you doing in here? His voice cracked like a whip, harsher than he meant, but it carried the weight of a rule never to be broken. Lydia froze, small shoulders tightening. She looked back at the door as if waiting for her mother to come rescue her. But Serena was still in the kitchen, drying her coat and trying to get her bearings after dragging her daughter through the downpour. I just wanted to see, the girl whispered, inching toward a shelf, her fingers hovering near the spines. Out, now. Adrian pushed himself to his feet, anger and fear colliding in his chest. The library was a sanctuary, the one place untouched by pitying glances or corporate vultures. No one was supposed to see him here, not this vulnerable version of himself. Serena rushed in, cheeks flushed with worry. Mr. Marlowe, I'm so sorry. The rain came so fast, I couldn't leave her home alone. I told her to stay by me, but Adrian cut her off with a glare. This room is off limits. You know that. I do. Please, it won't happen again. Don't fire me, sir. I need this job. Her voice trembled, not from the storm outside, but from the weight of fear every working mother knows. What would happen if the paycheck disappeared? Adrian clenched his jaw, words sharp on the tip of his tongue, when Lydia suddenly looked straight at him and asked, clear as a bell, "Are you afraid of dying?" The room fell still. Even the storm outside seemed to pause between thunderclaps. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to shout at her, to tell her she had no right to ask. But the innocence in her eyes stripped him bare. She hadn't meant to wound him. She had simply asked a question no one else dared. He turned his back, staring at the fire until the sting behind his eyes passed. "Take her out," he muttered. Serena placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, guiding her toward the door. But the child looked over her shoulder, unblinking, as if waiting for an answer he refused to give. The phone on Adrian's desk buzzed, its screen lighting up a familiar name, Victor Hale. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Adrian," Victor's voice came smooth and cutting. "The board's getting restless. Word about your health is spreading. You can't keep pretending forever. It's time to consider transition. Sign the papers. Step aside while there's still some dignity left." Adrian gripped the edge of the desk, forcing his tone steady. "I'll manage my company until I decide otherwise." "You may not get that choice much longer," Victor replied, then hung up, leaving only the hiss of the storm and the crackle of fire. Adrian stared at the phone, the bitterness of helplessness rising in his chest. First the girl, now Victor. Everyone wanted a piece of what he guarded most, whether it was his privacy or his power. A loud crash shook the house. The storm had taken out the power lines, plunging Edgewood Manor into darkness. Serena reappeared at the door, Lydia clinging to her hand. "Sir, the roads are flooding. We can't make it home tonight." Adrian opened his mouth to argue, but the howling wind and the child's shivering frame silenced him. He looked from the storm outside to the pair before him, the first living souls to break into his fortress of silence in years. "Fine," he said at last, voice low, resigned. "Stay the night, but keep her out of this room." The storm finally passed, leaving the world outside washed clean. By morning, soft light spilled to the tall windows of Edgewood Manor, turning the wet branches of the pines into silver lace. The house looked brighter than it had in days, yet the air inside remained taut, strung with silence and unease. Adrian moved about his home with a kind of restlessness, every sound magnified by the presence of others. He wasn't used to the shuffle of small feet on polished floors or the quiet humming of a woman tidying the kitchen. For years, Edgewood Manor had been a fortress. Every room is alone. Now the walls echoed differently, filled with unfamiliar energy that unsettled him. At breakfast, Serena kept her head down, folding napkins and placing cups carefully, as if she were trying not to stir the air around him. Lydia, however, was different. She darted from one corner to another, curiosity sparkling in her eyes. She asked questions Adrian had no interest in answering. What was behind the locked doors, why the mirrors in the hallway were covered, and why he never sat at the long dining table but preferred the smaller one by the window. Every word from the girl tugged at him, especially the one she left him the night before. "Are you afraid of dying?" He hadn't slept well since. The question had slipped under his skin like a splinter. Serena must have noticed his tension, because she paused and spoke gently. "She's a child, Mr. Marlowe. Sometimes children ask things they don't understand." Adrian lifted his eyes, sharp with irritation. Children should learn what not to ask. Her gaze didn't falter, though her hands twisted together at her waist. Or maybe adults should learn how to answer. He had no reply. Instead, he turned away, retreating deeper into the house where he thought silence might protect him. Later, while Serena dusted the shelves in the parlor, Lydia wandered into a side room that hadn't seen use in years. In the corner stood a piano, its mahogany case dulled with neglect. She slid onto the bench, her small fingers pressing the keys. The notes came out broken, uneven, yet they floated up into the air with a strange kind of charm. Adrian's voice cut across the music, abrupt and cold. "Leave it. That piano is not a toy. The girl jumped, guilt flashing across her face. But before she could speak, Serena appeared, pulling her back gently. I'm sorry. She didn't mean any harm. Adrian said nothing more, but that evening, long after the house had quieted, he found himself drawn back to that room. He sat at the piano in the dark, his hand hovering over the keys. The next afternoon, Serena discovered something on the kitchen counter, a sheet of paper, edges smudged with colored pencil. It was Lydia's drawing, a tall man standing alone inside a high wall, his face blank, the sky above him gray. Serena stared at it, her chest tightening. The child had seen it more clearly than anyone else. She wondered if Adrian would see it the same way. He did. Lydia, proud of her work, carried it to the library and held it up. This is you, she said simply. Adrian looked at the picture, then at her. For a moment, something cracked across his face. Pain, recognition, maybe shame. He snatched the drawing and tore it down the middle. The sound of paper ripping echoed sharp in the quiet room. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. She turned and fled before either adult could say a word. Serena stood frozen, a mix of anger and sorrow burning in her throat. But Adrian only tossed the pieces onto his desk, his jaw locked. Hours later, when the house was still, he returned to the desk. His hand hovered over the torn fragments. Slowly, almost against his own will, he gathered them up and slid them into the drawer with his journal. He sat back, staring into the dark, wondering why it was easier to keep pieces of a broken picture than to face the truth it revealed. The conference room at Marlowe Industries was colder than usual that morning, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the silence that followed Victor Hale's words. He stood at the head of the long table, lips curved in that practiced half-smile, as he laid out rumors he'd carefully seeded. Gentlemen, ladies, the market is asking questions. Investors want stability. If Mr. Marlowe is truly unwell, transparency is our only option. Adrian sat rigid at the far end, his hands clasped tighter than they should have been. The board members shifted in their seats, glancing at him the way people look at a cracked vase, wondering when it will collapse. He hated it. The whispers, the pity, the suspicion. My health is not your concern, Adrian said, voice low but steady. The company is strong. I am still in charge. Victor tilted his head, eyes narrowing. For now, perhaps, but a corporation doesn't thrive on secrecy. If you fall, the rest of us fall with you. The meeting ended with a flurry of paper and muted voices. Adrian walked out without shaking a hand, his chest tight. By the time he reached the restroom, the cough he'd been holding back tore loose. He leaned against the sink, covering his mouth with a handkerchief, and when he pulled it away, there were specks of red. He rinsed them down quickly, ashamed, as if the porcelain basin might gossip to the world. Back at Edgewood Manor, the contrast was jarring. The storm had passed, and the house carried new scents. Serena was in the kitchen, pulling a tray of cookies from the oven. Lydia perched on a stool, laughing at something her mother whispered. The warmth of cinnamon drifted into the hallway. Adrian paused unseen and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Annoyance, perhaps, or longing. He turned away before they noticed him, but the sound of their laughter trailed after him like a shadow he couldn't shake. That evening, he sat on the porch as dusk settled. Lydia padded out barefoot, settling into the chair beside him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They watched the rain-soaked yard steam in the fading light. You know what you remind me of? Lydia asked suddenly. Adrian raised an eyebrow. What? A castle without people in it. Really big, really pretty, but kind of sad. Like nobody lives there. The words struck harder than he expected. For a moment his throat tightened, and he turned his face away, so she wouldn't see the moisture in his eyes. He rose abruptly, muttering something about work, and left her swinging her legs in the chair, puzzled but unafraid. Later, while putting laundry away in the study, Serena stumbled across a folder lying half open on his desk. Curiosity, or perhaps instinct, led her to peek inside. Her breath caught when she saw it. A draft agreement transferring major assets of Marlowe Industries. Victor Hale's name scrawled neatly on the signature page. And below, Adrian's own hesitant initials from some night when fear had outweighed resolve. When Adrian walked in and saw her holding it, his face hardened. "That's private." "Victor's trying to take everything from you," she said softly, almost pleading. "Why would you even think of signing this?" "Because it's mine to decide," he snapped. "Not yours. Not anyone else's. Stay out of it." Serena set the folder down carefully, her eyes steady despite the sting in her chest. "You think you're protecting something, but all you're doing is letting him win." He didn't answer. His silence was sharper than anger. The boardroom at Marlowe Industries had always been Adrian's stage. He had built his empire inside these glass walls, his voice steady, his presence enough to settle the most restless investor. But today the air was different, charged, expectant, and unkind. Victor Hale leaned forward, his polished cufflinks catching the light, his tone deceptively casual. "Adrian, we've all noticed you've been absent lately. Missed meetings, shortened hours. We'd like clarity. Is it just stress, or is there something more we should be aware of?" A dozen eyes turned toward him. Adrian straightened in his chair, feeling the weight of every gaze. His palms dampened, though his voice came measured. "Running a global corporation is demanding. I've carried it on my shoulders for decades. Fatigue is not an illness." Victor gave a smile that wasn't a smile at all. He slid a thin folder across the table, the papers inside already fanned out like a weapon. "Then, perhaps you'll explain this." On the screen behind him, projected for the entire board, appeared medical records, scans, lab results, notes from St. Hilaire Medical Center. Confidential details that should never have left the doctor's office. Adrian felt his stomach drop. His vision swam, and he gripped the armrest to keep from slipping into the spiral of panic. "Stage 4 cancer," Victor said softly, almost with sympathy, though his eyes glimmered with triumph. "We all respect your legacy, Adrian. But this company can't be run on secrecy and hope." The room buzzed, muted voices tumbling over one another. Charts flickered on the screen, profit margins, falling stocks, red arrows stabbing downward. Cold data in contrast with the warmth draining from Adrian's body. He sat there, staring at numbers while the edges of his vision blurred with a dull ache of exhaustion and humiliation. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He coughed, sharp and sudden, the sound cutting across the table. A handkerchief covered his mouth, but when he lowered it, a faint smear of red betrayed him. The murmurs grew louder. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Marlowe, given these circumstances, the board recommends you step back temporarily for the stability of the company." Victor folded his hands, victorious in silence. Adrian nodded once, a gesture meant to look like composure but felt like surrender. His whole life, 40 years of ruthless work, reduced to a folder wave in front of him in pity in the eyes of men who once feared him. When the meeting finally adjourned, Adrian walked out without looking back. Each step felt heavier than the last. At home that evening, Edgewood Manor greeted him with the faint smell of butter and wood polish. He expected a quiet, but instead there was soft, hesitant notes from the parlor. Lydia sat at the old piano, her small hand stumbling through a melody she must have practiced all day. She turned when she heard him. "Mr. Marlowe, listen, I can play now." He stood in the doorway, torn between irritation and a pull he didn't understand. He wanted to retreat, to keep the walls up, but the music, broken as it was, reached something deep in him. He walked over, lowered himself into the armchair by the piano, and let the sound wash over him. The sharp edge of anger dulled. Instead, a tide of grief rose. Tears blurred his vision before he could stop them. One slipped down his cheek, then another. He turned his face away, ashamed. Lydia stopped playing. "Did I do it wrong?" she asked in a small voice. "No," he whispered, throat tight. He shut the piano lid abruptly, the clap startling in the quiet room. "That's enough." He rose and left without another word. Behind him, Lydia sat frozen, staring at the closed lid, her fingers resting on the wood as though she might coax the music back. The house grew quiet again, but the echo of those fragile notes lingered in Adrian's chest, as unwelcome as they were unforgettable. The rain had been falling for hours, steady and relentless, as if the sky itself wanted to weigh down the world. Edgewood Manor creaked against the storm, the gutters overflowing, branches slapping against the glass panes. Inside, the house was dim. Lamps glowed faintly in the hallways, but the shadows stretched long, curling into corners like reminders of everything Adrian had tried to hide. He sat in the library, the room he guarded most, the phone pressed tightly to his ear. Victor Hale's voice filled the space with the polished confidence of a man who smelled blood in the water. "You can't keep this up, Adrian. Everyone knows. The investors, the board, they're already talking. If you drag this out, you'll lose control on their terms. Sign the agreement, make it permanent, and at least you'll decide how you leave." Adrian's hand trembled slightly, though his voice came clipped and cold. "I built this company. I don't need you telling me how to end it." "Then face it," Victor said, his tone dripping with feigned sympathy. "You don't have long. Step aside with grace, or they'll force you out with shame." The call ended with a click, leaving only the patter of rain against the windows. Adrian held the phone in his lap, fingers tight enough to whiten his knuckles. He had fought a lifetime to hold power, and now his own body was betraying him, making him weak enough that men like Victor could circle. From the hallway came the faint rustle of fabric. Serena had been walking past when she caught enough of the conversation to understand. She hesitated, then stepped into the doorway. The flicker of the fire revealed her expression, careful but steady, eyes searching his. "You're letting him box you in," she said quietly. Adrian shot her a sharp look. "This doesn't concern you." "It does when it eats you alive." "I heard what he said. He's trying to strip away everything you worked for, and you're letting him." He pushed himself to his feet, anger rising like heat under his collar. "You don't understand what this is. This company is all I have. Every deal, every decision. It's my entire life carved into stone. If I lose it, I'm nothing." Serena stepped farther into the room, not cowed by his temper. Her voice steadied, but there was steel underneath. "You're wrong. Lydia doesn't care about your company, Adrian. She doesn't need numbers or contracts. She needs someone who won't disappear. Someone who's here when she looks for him. That's worth more than every dollar in your accounts." Her words struck him where Victor's threats never could. For a moment his face faltered, the mask cracking, but fear rushed back in, stronger than reason. The fear of being erased, of leaving no mark except a falling stock price. He couldn't let her see that. Instead, he reached for the draft contract lying on the desk, the one Victor had prepared. In a flash of rage, he ripped it in two, the sound of tearing paper cutting across the room. Pieces fluttered to the rug like dead leaves. "There. Is that what you wanted?" Serena didn't flinch. She watched him, eyes filled not with triumph but with something closer to sorrow. "It doesn't matter what you rip up if you don't believe it yourself." Adrian's breath came harsh. He bent quickly, gathering the halves together, stuffing them into a drawer as though the very act of hiding them proved her right. He could not let go, even of scraps. "You think walls will keep you safe," she said softly, "but they're the very thing suffocating you." He turned away, unwilling to let her see the tremor in his hand. The fire snapped, throwing sparks into the dark, and the storm outside groaned like the house itself was warning him. Serena left without another word. Her footsteps receded down the corridor until only the thunder filled the silence. Adrian stayed where he was, staring at the clothes drawer, then at the edge of his journal, where Lydia's drawing still poked out, the man trapped behind towering walls. He felt as though both images, the torn contract and the child sketch, were pressing against him, demanding he choose which truth he would live with. Pain suddenly stabbed through his chest. He gripped the back of the chair, but the strength went out of him. A cough tore free, sharp and wet, dragging him to his knees. The fire blurred, the shelves spun. He tried to stand but collapsed onto the rug, gasping against the weight of his own failing lungs. "Mr. Marlowe?" The voice was high and frightened. Lydia had wandered close, maybe following the sound of his cough. She froze at the sight of him sprawled on the floor, his face pale, his breath ragged. Her scream split the night. "Mom, hurry!" She ran to him, tugging at his sleeve with tiny hands that shook. Her tears streaked down, her voice cracking with panic. "Please get up. Don't leave." Adrian tried to answer, but no sound came. All he felt was her body pressed desperately against him, holding tight as if she could anchor him here. Serena rushed in, eyes wide with terror. But in those seconds before she reached them, Adrian realized something no contract could teach him. The fortress he'd built around himself was nothing but empty stone. The only thing tethering him to life in that moment was the fragile embrace of an 8-year-old who refused to let him go. The first thing Adrian saw when he opened his eyes was the sterile glow of hospital lights. Their hum was faint but steady, a reminder he was not in his library, not at Edgewood Manor, but in a place where weakness had no curtain to hide behind. His body felt heavy, like someone had laid bricks across his chest. He turned his head slightly and caught sight of Serena sitting stiffly in a chair, a book in her lap she clearly hadn't been reading. Beside her, curled against the armrest, Lydia dozed, her head bobbing every so often before Serena steadied her. When Serena noticed he was awake, she straightened. Relief flickered across her face, though her voice carried its usual restraint. "You scared her. You scared both of us." Adrian cleared his throat, his voice gravelly. "It was nothing. Nothing." Serena's jaw tightened. "You collapsed? That's not nothing." Before he could answer, Lydia stirred. She blinked awake, then scrambled off the chair to his bedside. "You're okay," she whispered, as though testing the words. Without waiting for permission, she slid something out from under her sweater, a folded sheet of paper, smudged at the edges where her fingers had clutched it too tightly. Serena started to reach for it, as if to intercept, but Lydia shook her head. "No, Mom. I wanted to have it." Adrian looked at the child, then at the paper she thrust into his hand. He unfolded it slowly. The drawing was simple, uneven strokes of crayon, but what it showed made his throat close. 3 figures stood in front of Edgewood Manor, all holding hands. Above them, in shaky, oversized letters, were the words, "Bonus Dad." The room seemed to shrink around him. He blinked hard, folding the paper with precision that looked practiced, like a man tucking away a contract he didn't want examined. He slid it into the narrow drawer of the bedside table. "Thank you," he said softly, almost inaudible. Lydia's face fell, the hope in her eyes dimming. She nodded, retreating to her mother's side. Serena rested a hand on her daughter's shoulder, but kept her gaze on Adrian. Later that afternoon, while Adrian dozed, the television in the corner came alive with a press conference. Victor Hale stood at a podium, cameras flashing as his voice carried with false gravitas. For the good of Marlowe Industries and to protect the confidence of our investors, a transition plan is underway. Mr. Marlowe's health has made it necessary. The company's future remains bright, secure in new leadership. The cheering at the bottom of the screen was merciless, the lonely king fading. Marlowe's last days of power. Serena muted the volume before Lydia could hear more, but Adrian had already stirred, his eyes half open, catching every word without needing the sound. The expression on his face was unreadable, though his hands clenched around the blanket. When visiting hours grew quiet, Serena leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "Is this really how you want to be remembered? A headline, a statistic, a man who left nothing behind but stock prices?" He turned his head away, staring at the pale wall. "You've spent your whole life guarding what you built," she continued, "but you're blind to the one thing you could still be. My daughter sees you as more than some figure on a magazine cover. She's asking for a father. Maybe not in name, but in love. And you." She stopped, her voice trembling despite her control. "You're too scared to even look at the picture she drew." Adrian closed his eyes, silence stretching between them. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that the company defined him, that without it he was a hollow man. But the image of the crayon figures pressed at the back of his mind, relentless. When Serena finally rose to settle Lydia for the night, Adrian remained still. The room dimmed as the nurse turned down the lights. Alone again, he reached for the drawer. His hand shook as he pulled out the folded sheet. He opened it slowly, as though the paper itself might shatter. His eyes traced the childish lines, the crooked letters spelling words he had never imagined tied to his name. "Bonus Dad." The storm came down hard that night. The kind of rain that pounded the roof until it sounded like 1,000 drums. Wind rattled the old windows of Edgewood Manor, and just when the thunder cracked the sky wide open, the lights flickered and went dark. The house, so vast and usually filled with silence, was swallowed by the sound of the storm and the sudden hush of electricity gone. In the library, Adrian sat alone, the glow of the dying fire barely reaching his chair. On the table before him lay two objects that seemed to mock each other: the crisp, heavy contract Victor had sent and the crumpled, childlike drawing Lydia had given him at the hospital. He stared at both, his fingers twitching between the fountain pen and the folded piece of paper. The contract was everything he had worked for, everything that defined him in the world's eyes. The company had been his shield, his monument, his way of proving he mattered. Yet the drawing, 3 figures holding hands in front of his house, was something no amount of wealth or power had ever offered him. It carried a weight of its own, fragile but undeniable. From down the hall, faint voices rose against the roar of the storm. Serena and Lydia had gathered candles, their shadows dancing along the walls as they moved about the living room. Adrian could hear them humming, the sound uncertain at first, then growing steady, like they were daring the storm to do its worst. Their tune carried through the halls, and for reasons he didn't understand, it made the library feel smaller, lonelier. The door creaked open suddenly, and Lydia stepped inside, her small hands cupped around a stubby candle. The flame flickered, lighting her face in warm gold. She walked up to his chair and placed the candle on the desk beside the contract. "You can light it if it feels too dark," she said simply, then glanced at the contract without a trace of recognition. To her, it was just another piece of paper. Adrian's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her to leave, to return to her mother, but the word stuck. All he managed was a gruff nod. Lydia gave him a little smile, then turned to go. Before she left the room, she called over her shoulder, her voice ringing clear over the storm. "Bonus, Dad, come eat with us. We save you a place." The words hit him harder than any boredom betrayal, harder than Victor's threats. "Bonus, Dad." He let the pen hover over the signature line of the contract, his hand shaking with the effort to steady it. The ink bled against the tip, waiting for his decision. He thought about the headlines, the investors, the empire he had built brick by brick. He thought about how empty all of it felt when the lights went out and no one was there to sit at the table with him. Then he heard Lydia laugh in the other room, a bright sound that cut through the storm like a bell. His hand fell from the page. The pen rolled away, forgotten. Slowly, he closed the folder on the contract and pushed it aside. For a long moment, he stayed frozen in the chair, his heart pounding like the storm outside. Then, almost without realizing it, he stood. His legs felt unsteady, his body worn down by sickness and years of isolation, but he walked toward the open door. The hallway stretched before him, dimly lit by candlelight, the voices of Serena and Lydia carrying through the air like a lifeline. He hadn't stepped out of the library for dinner in years. He had made the room his fortress, his cage. Yet tonight the door stood open, the pull too strong to ignore. When he entered the living room, Serena looked up from where she and Lydia had arranged a modest meal on the table, just soup and bread, but the sight of it, lit by candles, seemed warmer than anything money could buy. Lydia beamed at him, her small hands waving him closer. "There's your chair," she said proudly, as though she had been saving it all along. Adrian paused, taking in the sight, a table that wasn't about power or deals, but about belonging. His chest ached, not just from his illness, but from something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. He pulled the chair out, the legs scraping softly against the wooden floor. Then Adrian Marlowe sat at a table not as a CEO, not as a man guarding his empire, but as someone simply asked to stay. Adrian's strength returned in fragments, never steady, never complete. Some mornings he could walk the halls of Edgewood Manor without faltering, while others left him breathless after only a few steps. The house felt different now, though. It was no longer just stone and wood, but a place filled with sound. Serena's voice carried from the kitchen. Lydia's laughter echoed up the stairwell, and the piano that had long sat untouched was waking up under small, uncertain hands. Outside those walls, however, the world was closing in, Rumors about his illness spread like wildfire. Investors panicked. Stock prices plunged, and Marlowe Industries, his life's work, teetered on the edge of collapse. Victor Hale fed the frenzy, presenting himself as a stable alternative. On television and in print, Victor painted Adrian as a selfish relic, a stubborn old man clinging to power while the company bled. Adrian read the headlines in silence. The lonely king of Edgewood Manor. Marlowe Industries in decline. The words didn't sting the way he thought they would. Instead, they left him hollow. The empire he had built was crumbling, and he wondered if perhaps it was his own walls, his refusal to let anyone in, that had doomed it. One afternoon, as the rain tapped gently against the tall windows, Lydia tugged at his sleeve. "Will you sit with me while I practice?" she asked, her eyes wide, hopeful. Normally he would brush her off, hiding behind his usual excuses of work or fatigue. But something in her voice, gentle, almost pleading, softened him. Without a word, Adrian followed her into the music room. The piano gleamed faintly under the low light, its keys worn with age. Lydia climbed onto the bench, feet swinging above the floor, and began plunking out a simple melody. The notes were uneven, sometimes halting, but she played with a seriousness that touched him. Adrian sat in the chair beside her, hands folded, listening. Each note carried through the house like a question he had never dared to answer. He didn't speak, didn't correct her mistakes. He just listened, and in that quiet, he felt something break open inside him. When the song ended, Lydia glanced sideways at him. "Did I do okay?" Adrian's throat tightened. He nodded. "You did better than okay," he said, his voice hoarse. Her smile lit up the room. "Then next time, you can play with me." That night, after she had gone to bed, Adrian sat at his desk with his attorney on the phone. The draft of his will lay before him, heavy with consequence. "I want everything left to charity," he told the lawyer. "Every cent, every share. If Victor gets his hands on it, it'll all rot." The lawyer hesitated on the other end. "Are you sure, Adrian? No family, no personal beneficiaries at all." Adrian closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw Serena's quiet determination, Lydia's small hand clutching a candle in the dark, her voice calling him bonus dad. His chest ached. He wanted to protect them, to leave them something that said they mattered to him. Yet fear gnawed at him. Fear of attaching them to a dying man. Fear of leaving them with grief instead of gifts. "I'm sure," he muttered, though the words felt brittle. When he hung up, he stayed seated at the desk, staring at the will. He tried to convince himself it was the right choice, that erasing himself cleanly would spare them pain. But the truth pressed in. His heart wasn't the ink on the page. The following morning, Serena found him pacing by the window, looking out at the gray sky. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. He turned sharply. "You think I'm not alone? Every choice I've ever made was to build something that would last. And now it's slipping away because my body's betraying me." Serena stepped closer. "Maybe what lasts isn't what you think. Lydia doesn't care about the company, Adrian. She cares about you. She'll remember who sat beside her at the piano, not who signed the contracts." Her words struck something deep, but he didn't answer. He couldn't, not yet. By the end of the week, Victor had summoned the board for a final meeting, pushing for Adrian's removal. The pressure mounted. Headlines grew harsher, and whispers of bankruptcy floated through the corridors of Marlowe Industries. Adrian dressed for the meeting with trembling hands, every button of his suit feeling heavier than the last. Before leaving the manor, he paused at the piano. Lydia had left her sheet music open, a clumsy line of notes marked in bright crayon. He touched the page, then let his hand fall. When he arrived at the company's headquarters, the boardroom lights glared down on him. Faces turned, expectant, skeptical, already half decided. Victor sat at the far end of the table, confident. Paper spread before him like a crown waiting to be claimed. Adrian drew a slow breath. He carried two legacies with him into that room. The one written in contracts and stock certificates, and the one drawn in crayon by a child who believed in him. He knew he couldn't keep both. The night after the boardroom battle, Adrian returned to Edgewood Manor with a weight heavier than any defeat he had known. The halls were silent, shadows stretching across the walls like silent judges. He loosened his tie, bracing himself for solitude, when the phone rang. Serena's voice was frantic. "It's Lydia!" She spiked a fever. It came out of nowhere. "We're at St. Hilaire." They rushed her into the emergency wing. For a man who had built his life on control, Adrian felt the floor vanish beneath him. The world blurred, and by the time his car pulled into the hospital parking lot, the storm outside had broken loose, wind and rain pelting the windshield like accusations. Inside the sterile halls, the beeping of machines and the rush of footsteps carved a sharp contrast to the quiet of the manor. He found Serena standing outside a room, pale and trembling. "She kept calling for you," Serena whispered. Even half delirious, she kept saying, "Don't go." Adrian froze. That small voice, Lydia's voice, pierced through every wall he had built over decades. He entered the room, and the sight nearly undid him. Lydia lay still, cheeks flushed red with fever, hair plastered to her damp forehead. Her lips moved weakly. "Don't go, don't go." The words gutted him. All his life, he had convinced himself that distance was safer, that walls protected him from loss. Yet here was a child, fragile and burning with fever, begging him not to vanish, and he knew with terrifying clarity he couldn't survive losing her. He sat down, hands shaking as he reached for hers. Her small fingers curled instinctively around his. Adrian bent close, his voice breaking. "I'm not leaving, Lydia. Do you hear me? I'm right here. I'll stay." Her breathing steadied just a fraction, as if those words alone had given her strength. Serena pressed a hand to her mouth, tears sliding silently down her face. While Adrian clung to Lydia's hand, the outside world turned merciless. News alerts buzzed on his phone. Victor stood at a podium, cameras flashing around him. "Mr. Marlowe has chosen to step back," Victor declared smoothly. "For the good of the company, I'll assume responsibility to guide us through this uncertain time." Headlines appear within minutes. Victor Hale seizes control. Marlowe era ends. Adrian's empire was being signed away in the court of public opinion, while he sat in a dim hospital room, powerless. But he didn't care about the empire. What terrified him wasn't the thought of losing the company. It was the thought of Lydia's small hand slipping from his. Hours passed in heavy silence, broken only by the machines monitoring her pulse. Adrian leaned back, exhaustion pressing down on him, but he never let go of her hand. His mind churned with old fears, that he was too broken to matter, that anyone who leaned on him would only be left with grief. Yet looking at Lydia's face, damp with fever but peaceful as she rested, he felt a faint stir of something he thought he had buried long ago, the will to stay alive. Serena sat across from him, watching. "You think strength means holding on to your company," she said softly, careful not to wake her daughter. "But maybe strength is just choosing not to walk away when someone needs you." Adrian swallowed hard, unable to answer, but her words lingered. His phone buzzed again, this time not with headlines, but with a message from Dr. Langley. Hesitant, Adrian opened it. The word seemed almost unreal. Latest test results show unexpected improvement. Condition may be stabilizing. We'll discuss in the morning. He stared at the message until the letters blurred. Hope, something he had banished from his life, crept back in, uninvited and overwhelming. Adrian exhaled a long, trembling breath. For years, he had believed that his life was narrowing toward an inevitable end, nothing but walls and silence waiting for him. But in that hospital room, with Lydia's hand in his and the faint possibility of healing flickering on his phone screen, he realized that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't finished. That night, he whispered again, firmer this time, as if saying aloud could carve it into reality. "I'm here, Lydia. I'm not going anywhere." Morning light filtered weakly through the blinds at St. Hilaire, casting thin stripes across the quiet room. Machines hummed steadily, a reminder that Lydia had made it through the worst of her fever. She was still asleep, her face pale but peaceful, her small hand resting outside the blanket. Serena sat slumped beside her, chin against her chest, finally overcome by exhaustion. Adrian stood at the foot of the bed, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the scene in front of him. It was such an ordinary sight, mother and daughter tucked into the rhythm of survival. Yet it pierced him deeper than any hostile boardroom or headline ever had. He had spent decades defending walls and empires, but this picture of fragile closeness was something he had never managed to build for himself. He thought of all the nights he had walked the halls of Edgewood Manor, its chandeliers dark, its grand dining table long abandoned. Now, here in a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and worn linoleum, he saw what had been missing: a family. Not perfect, not promised forever, but real. And that realization tore him apart. If he let go of the company, his life's work would dissolve into dust, and Victor would no doubt seize every weakness to stamp out his name. But if he clung to Marlowe Industries the way he always had, he knew what it would cost. He'd watch Serena and Lydia walk out his life, leaving him with nothing but ledgers and empty rooms. The battle inside him felt almost physical, like his chest might crack under the weight of it. By mid-morning, he had made a decision. He asked his assistant to send for his lawyer, Mr. Kavanaugh, who arrived quietly at the hospital with a folder under his arm. They stepped into the waiting lounge, its plastic chairs and faded magazines a strange place for such a moment. "I want changes made," Adrian said, his voice low but firm. His hands shook as he reached the pen. The company, most of it will remain in trust, shielded from Victor, but Edgewood Manor, and part of my personal estate, those will go to Serena and Lydia. Kavanaugh raised his brows but didn't question it. "Are you certain? This alters everything you've arranged." Adrian exhaled slowly. "I'm certain. I don't want that house to be a mausoleum anymore. I want it to be there's a home, not a tombstone with my name on it." The lawyer nodded and began taking notes. Adrian felt as though his words carried meaning beyond contracts and percentages. This wasn't about control or pride. It was about giving shape to something he had always denied himself: belonging. When he returned to Lydia's room, Serena stirred awake, eyes red from lack of sleep. "She's resting better," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Adrian only nodded, standing near the bed. He didn't tell her what he had just done. Not yet. But as he looked at Lydia's small chest rising and falling, a fragile rhythm of persistence, he silently repeated his new promise. This child would never be left with only empty halls and fading portraits. He stayed until afternoon, when duty called him back to the world he had built. Before leaving, he brushed his fingers lightly across the side of Lydia's hand. She shifted in her sleep, mumbling something incomprehensible, but the sound tethered him. "Rest, little one," he murmured, surprising himself with the tenderness in his tone. Then he straightened, turned to Serena, and said quietly, "I'll be back, but I need to finish something." She studied him, searching his face, a man who had once been nothing but cold granite. "Whatever it is," she said, "don't forget what really matters when you walk out those doors." Adrian gave a faint nod, not trusting himself to say more. The drive from the hospital to Marlowe Industries felt different this time. Rain from the night before had left the city's streets slick, and the skyline looked sharper, almost accusing. Every stoplight felt like a test. Every turn another chance to retreat. Yet his grip on the steering wheel was steady. By the time he pulled into the underground garage, the weight in his chest had settled into something clear: resolve. He had chosen. He would not sacrifice the company blindly, but he would no longer let it own him completely. Victor was waiting. Adrian knew the man would already be positioning himself as heir apparent, feeding the press and whispering into the ears of nervous investors. But Adrian wasn't walking into that building as the same man who had collapsed alone in the manor weeks ago. He was walking in as someone who had felt the small hand of a child cling to his, someone who now carried a different kind of responsibility. As the elevator doors closed, reflecting his worn face back at him, Adrian whispered under his breath, almost like a prayer, "This ends today." And when the elevator opened into the marble halls of Marlowe Industries, Adrian Marlowe stepped forward, not as the untouchable titan he had once been, but as a man who finally knew what he was willing to fight for. The boardroom at Marlowe Industries had never been so crowded. Every seat around the long mahogany table was taken, and beyond the glass walls, a small army of journalists and photographers waited, their lenses pointed like weapons. The air was thick with anticipation, and the faint hum of whispered speculation. Everyone knew something decisive was about to unfold. Victor Hale stood at the head of the table, his confidence radiating like a practice performance. He tapped a folder against the table to command silence, then began. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "We are here because Adrian Marlowe, once the iron pillar of this company, is no longer fit to lead. His illness is no secret anymore. Marlowe Industries deserves stability, not sentimentality. And so, he lifted a document for all to see. Here's the transfer of authority. With his signature, the company will be shielded from collapse." A murmur rippled through the room, pen scratching, eyes narrowing. The cameras outside flickered like lightning against the glass. Then the doors opened. Adrian entered, thinner than before, his frame slightly hunched, but his presence drew every eye. His cane clicked against the polished floor as he walked to his seat. He did not look at Victor. He did not need to. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, belonged to a man who had built the empire from the ground up. Victor forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Adrian, I didn't think you had the strength to attend." Adrian set his cane down, steadied himself with both hands on the table, and spoke. His voice was rough but clear. "You're right about one thing, Victor. I am not the man I used to be. My body is failing. But weakness of flesh does not erase the strength of a lifetime." The room quieted. Even the reporters beyond the glass seemed to pause. "I will step down as CEO," Adrian continued. The words caused a collective gasp, and Victor's smirk spread in triumph until Adrian raised a hand. "But I will not hand this company to you. Marlowe Industries was never meant to be one man's kingdom. It will survive not through greed or ambition, but through stewardship." He gestured to the legal documents. His attorney slid onto the table. "I am instituting a shared governance model. Our leadership will be broad and balanced and accountable. The employees who have given their lives to this company will not be pawns in your schemes. And as for my personal wealth," his eyes softened just for a moment, "that will go not to feed your hunger, Victor, but to a family I have chosen to love, a family that has shown me what loyalty truly means." Gasps, murmurs, and startled glances erupted around the table. A few board members leaned forward, whispering furiously to one another. Others, surprisingly, nodded, the rawness in Adrian's tone, so uncharacteristic of his usual armor, rang truer than any polished corporate speech. Victor's face flushed red. He slammed his palm against the table. "This is madness. You've been manipulated by a maid and her child. Is this what Marlowe Industries has come to? A billion-dollar empire hijacked by sentiment?" At that moment, the doors opened again. Serena stepped in, her presence quiet but unflinching. She wore no business suit, only her simple clothes, but she walked with dignity. Every camera snapped to her. "You can call us what you like," Serena said, her voice calm, steady. She stopped beside Adrian, her hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. "But when everyone else turned their back on him, we stayed. Not for money, not for power, just because he was alone." The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. Adrian's eyes glistened, though he quickly lowered his gaze. Some board members shifted in their seats, clearly moved. Others looked at Victor with unease, as if they had just glimpsed the smallness behind his fury. Victor's composure cracked. He rose, pointing a finger at Serena. "This is absurd. You!" His voice broke into a shout, ugly and desperate. "You don't belong here. This is corporate business, not a fairy tale." The chairman of the board cleared his throat, his gavel striking the table. "Enough. This matter cannot linger. We will resolve it now. The board will vote immediately." A collective breath filled the room. The stakes, once hidden in whispers and strategies, now stood naked before everyone. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his hand brushing against Serena's briefly, a silent acknowledgement that he was no longer fighting alone. The boardroom felt more like a battlefield than a place of business. The air was tight, filled with tension that pressed down on every chest. Around the long table, shareholders leaned in, some clutching folders, others whispering hurriedly, while executives shifted nervously in their seats. Behind the glass walls, members of the press watched with hungry eyes, their cameras flashing whenever a voice rose. "Victor Hale," thrived in the chaos. He rose to his feet, his tailored suit immaculate, his smile thin and cutting. With a flick of his hand, he laid out a stack of papers in front of the board. "These," Victor announced, his tone sharp, "are internal documents and medical records, proof that Adrian Marlowe is no longer capable of making sound decisions. This company is bleeding under his stubborn grip, and now he hides behind the illusion of family, parading a maid and her child as though they could rescue Marlowe Industries." The words hit hard, cruel and deliberate. Gasps moved through the room, followed by whispers like ripples across water. Adrian sat still, his hands folded on the table. For a moment, his eyes dropped, and it seemed as though Victor's words might have struck their target. His chest tightened, because some of it was true. His strength was fading, his body often betraying him. The empire he had built stood on unsteady ground. But then his gaze shifted to the far end of the room. There, nearly hidden from the crowd, Serena sat with Lydia curled into her side. The little girl's legs dangled off the chair, her face anxious, but her eyes, those eyes, never left Adrian's. Something inside him steadied. He gripped the edge of the table and slowly pushed himself to his feet. His body trembled, but his voice carried. "Victor is right about one thing. I no longer have the strength to run a kingdom. My health is fragile, my years are numbered." His words hushed the room, as though admitting weakness itself was a rare act of power. He paused, his breath shaking, then continued. "But I do have enough strength left for something greater than numbers on a ledger. Enough to protect a home, to guard the only light left in a life too long lived in shadows." Victor scoffed, his voice laced with mockery. "What home? What family? You mean the woman you keep under your roof and her daughter? That's pity, Adrian, not legacy." Adrian's hand trembled as he reached into his jacket. He pulled out a document and laid it on the table for all to see. "This," he said, voice steady now, "is my will, amended this very morning. I have redirected the majority of my personal assets, not to this company, not to a rival, and certainly not to you, Victor, but to Serena and Lydia Rios, to ensure Edgewood Manor becomes a place of life, not an empty monument, to make sure that my legacy is not just steel and glass, but warmth and belonging." The words rippled through the boardroom like a storm breaking. Reporters outside leaned forward, snapping photographs at a furious pace. Board members shifted, their expressions ranging from shock to admiration. Victor slammed his hand on the table, his composure finally cracking. "You're throwing away everything for a fantasy. You let yourself be fooled by sentiment, and now you expect us to follow you off a cliff." Adrian turned to him, his voice low but clear. "You call it fantasy. I call it choosing to be remembered as more than a tyrant guarding his vaults. You can have the numbers, Victor. I'll take the truth." The chairman cleared his throat, his gavel striking the table once. "Enough. The matter has been debated. We will vote now." The room grew impossibly still. Board members straightened in their chairs, pens poised, ballots ready. Outside, the press hushed, waiting for the decision that would define the future of Marlowe Industries. Adrian lowered himself back into his seat, his breath shallow, his heart unsteady. He glanced once more at Serena and Lydia. Serena's hand clasped her daughter's, her eyes shining with quiet pride. Lydia gave him a tiny nod, as if she understood more than anyone realized. The first ballot was cast. Then the second. The scratching of pens against paper became the only sound in the room, each stroke echoing louder than a shout. By the time the last vote was marked, the atmosphere was unbearable. Every breath, every glance, carried the weight of history. The announcement of the vote, results swept through the boardroom like a wave breaking against stone. Adrian Marlowe, frail yet resolute, was granted the title of honorary chairman. It was a compromise, yes, but one that preserved his dignity and denied Victor control he had schemed for months to seize. The board members sat back in their chairs, murmurs rising, while the press outside scrambled to capture the shock on every face. Victor Hale did not take it quietly. His lips curled into a sneer as he slammed his fist against the polished oak table. The sharp crack echoed in the silence. "You think this is a victory, Adrian?" he spat. "Look at you, a husk clinging to sentiment. And you," He thrust his finger toward Serena and Lydia at the back of the room. "You two have leached off a dying man's guilt, manipulating him for money, for property, for every last drop of pity you can wring." Gasps filled the air. Serena's face went pale, her hands tightening protectively around her daughter's shoulders. Lydia flinched at the venom in Victor's voice, but tried to sit taller, her wide eyes darting between the men. For a moment, it seemed Adrian might stay seated, too weak to stand, too tired to fight anymore. His chest rose and fell heavily, and his fingers gripped the armrest like it was the only thing holding him upright. Then, slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. His body trembled, but his gaze locked on Victor's with a clarity that silenced even the whispers of the press. "You're right, Victor," Adrian began, his voice hoarse yet steady. "I was empty once. I lived in marble halls and counted fortunes, but inside I was nothing but dust. And you're right that my strength is fading. I don't deny it." He paused, then took a step forward. The room seemed to hold its breath. "But you're wrong about them. Serena and Lydia didn't drain me. They gave me what I never had the courage to seek. Something money has never been able to buy. They gave me life. And today I choose them. Not you, not your greed. Them." A hush swept through the boardroom, the kind of silence that feels like standing on holy ground. Adrian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, weighty object, the old brass key to Edgewood Manor. He turned, walked toward Serena, and placed it in her hand. His gesture was deliberate, public, unshakable. "This house," he said, loud enough for every board member and every journalist to hear, "was once nothing but walls and shadows. Today, it belongs to them. Let the world know it." The cameras clicked furiously, flashes of light capturing the moment as though history itself was being etched into the room. Serena's eyes welled, her lips parting in disbelief. Lydia looked down at the key in her mother's hand, and then up at Adrian with a smile so pure it almost broke him. Victor snapped. His composure shattered like glass. "You fool!" he shouted, his voice ragged. "You've let a servant and her brat reduce you to a laughingstock. You've destroyed everything we built." His tirade spilled out, incoherent with rage. His arms flailing as board members leaned back, appalled. Reporters leaned forward, scribbling every word, their cameras drinking in Victor's collapse. No one in the room missed a contrast. Adrian, frail but unshaken, standing beside the people he chose. Victor, red-faced and unraveling, consumed by bitterness. Adrian didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached down, took Lydia's small hand in his own, and together with Serena, walked toward the doors at the far end of the boardroom. The clicking of shoes against the polished floor was the only sound, each step ringing louder than Victor's fury. At the threshold, Adrian paused only once. He didn't look back at Victor. He didn't glance at the board. He simply tightened his grip on Lydia's hand and pushed the door open. The heavy doors swung shut behind them with a final, echoing thud, and in that closing sound was everything. A life of power, of isolation, of empire, ending at last. For Adrian, it was not defeat. It was release. He had chosen his legacy, not in the towers of Marlowe Industries, but in the fragile warmth of family that had waited for him all along. Outside, the corridors buzzed with questions, cameras flashing, reporters shouting his name. But Adrian didn't hear them. He only felt the small hand in his, guiding him forward. The morning after the vote, the halls of Marlowe Industries felt different. Gone was the aura of control Victor Hale had cultivated for years. The board of directors, shaken by the chaos of the previous evening, had quietly convened without him. What followed was swift and merciless. A motion to investigate Victor's conduct, his manipulations, his backroom deals, and a suspicious trail of leaked medical reports, passed with overwhelming support. News spread quickly. Financial journalists filled headlines with words like disgrace, power grab, and fall from grace. Victor's name was not accompanied by respect, but by disdain. The same shareholders who once toasted his ambition now whispered about him in clipped tones, already distancing themselves from the man they had once relied on. Victor stood in the center of the boardroom, the very room he had hoped to claim as his throne, and found himself alone. His voice, once sharp enough to command silence, faltered when no one cared to answer him. Lawyers began asking pointed questions. Some of the directors refused to meet his eyes. The empire he had schemed to own had turned against him in a single night. Out in the lobby, cameras were waiting, but no one crowded Victor for a statement. He wasn't a story anymore. He was the cautionary tale. Reporters called his name with the gleeful tone they use for men already half buried. And as Victor pushed through the mob, no allies stepped forward. No one shielded him. The crowd swallowed him whole, leaving him a solitary figure, red-eyed and furious, with nothing but his bitterness to hold on to. At that very moment, Adrian Marlowe was stepping out of the building with Serena and Lydia. The drizzle outside had cleared, and the late morning light broke through the gray clouds. They didn't leave through the executive entrance, lined with photographers. Instead, they slipped quietly to the back, where Adrian's driver had parked the car. Inside the vehicle, there was no talk of shareholders or board votes. Lydia climbed into the back seat beside Adrian, her small hand finding his larger, trembling one. She leaned close, her voice no louder than a whisper. "See? I told you, Bonus Dad doesn't need a castle. He just needs a home where people are." The words undid him. Adrian had spent his whole life defending his name, his company, and the reputation that had once made him untouchable. Yet none of those things had ever filled the hollow space in his chest. Hearing Lydia saw conviction, so simple, so unburdened by greed or legacy, struck deeper than any boredom attack Victor had ever launched. He looked down at her, and his smile came easily, not the polite, practiced smile he had worn at banquets or in interviews, but one that cracked through his weariness with startling honesty. His thumb brushed over her small fingers. "You're right," he murmured, almost to himself. "A house isn't worth much if it's empty." Serena, sitting across from them, watched in silence. She had seen the man at his weakest, raging against the loss of power and the certainty of illness. But here, in this fragile moment, she saw someone else, a man who had finally set down his armor. Adrian wasn't clinging to titles anymore. He was clinging to life, to them, and it made all the difference. The car pulled away from the building. In the side mirror, Adrian caught a glimpse of Victor. The once confident man stood at the curb, shoulders hunched, suit rumpled, his tie pulled loose as though the world had wrung him out. He watched their car with a look that was not just angry, but desperate, as if he knew he had lost more than a vote. He had lost the one thing Adrian had finally found, the one thing Victor could never manipulate into existence. The contrast was stark. Inside the car there was warmth. Lydia leaned her head against Adrian's arm. Serena exhaled in quiet relief, and even the air felt lighter than it had in months. Outside, Victor was left in the cold, stripped of his allies, his schemes, and the respect he had spent his life clawing for. Adrian didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The battle was over, and the victory wasn't about titles or companies. It was about the choice he had made, the choice to step away from the emptiness of empire and into the fragile, precious chaos of family. As the car turned the corner, Edgewood Manor, waiting at the end of the road, Adrian allowed himself to lean back against the seat. He was tired, but not defeated. For once, he wasn't thinking about what he might lose tomorrow. He was thinking about what he had gained today. And behind them, standing alone on the sidewalk, Victor Hale shrank into blur of the city, abandoned by the very world he had tried to control. The empire he had chased had slipped through his fingers, and the man he had sought to destroy was driving away, not weaker, but stronger than ever. Adrian reached for Lydia's hand again and held it firmly, as though to anchor himself in this new beginning. He glanced at Serena, who nodded back, her eyes softer than words could capture. Edgewood Manor had changed in ways Adrian would never have believed possible only a few months earlier. The house, once silent as stone, now carried life in every corner. Laughter traveled through the hallways, where echoes used to linger. From the kitchen drifted the buttery scent of Serena's baking, filling the air with warmth that outshone the chandeliers. Lydia's piano practice, halting and uneven, filled the parlor. She missed notes often, sometimes pressing the wrong key altogether, but the sound was alive, imperfect in the most beautiful way. Adrian sat in his favorite armchair by the window, a blanket around his knees, watching it all. He was still frail, his body not fully restored, yet something inside him had shifted. The doctors had spoken cautiously of encouraging signs, a phrase that months earlier he would have dismissed as a cruel attempt to soften the inevitable. Now he held on to it, not as a promise, but as a possibility. That evening, he called Serena and Lydia into the great hall. He had in his hand a small ring of keys, polished and newly cut. They jingled faintly as he turned them over in his palm. Serena looked at him curiously, her flower-dusted apron still tied around her waist. Lydia peeked out from behind her, her cheeks flushed with the effort of her practice. "These," Adrian said slowly, his voice steady though soft, "are for you both." He placed the keys into Serena's hand and folded her fingers around them. "This house, it was mine for too long. It was empty because I kept it that way. But no more. From now on, Edgewood Manor is not just my home. It is ours." Serena's eyes welled, her lips parting as if to speak. But for a long moment no words came. She finally whispered, "Adrian, are you sure?" "I've never been more certain of anything," he replied. "Family isn't just the one you're born into. It's the one you choose to stay with. I chose wrong for most of my life. I don't intend to make that mistake again." Lydia's face lit up as she threw her arms around him. "Does that mean we live here forever?" she asked, her voice bubbling with excitement. Adrian hugged her gently, pressing his cheek against her hair. "Yes," he murmured. "Forever sounds about right." From that night on, Edgewood Manor truly transformed. Serena moved through the rooms with ease, arranging flowers on windowsills, and leaving the scent of cinnamon wherever she worked. Lydia explored every hallway and hidden nook, her sketches of the old house pinned proudly on the refrigerator. Even the staff, once stiff and distant, softened in the presence of this small family. But it wasn't just the house that had changed. Adrian himself felt different. The weight of power, of reputation, of endless expectations. Those burdens had slipped from his shoulders. What replaced them was something lighter, yet infinitely stronger. The certainty that he belonged somewhere, to someone. On a late afternoon, when the sky over Portland blushed with streaks of orange and pink, Adrian sat on the porch with a blanket over his legs. The forest surrounding the manor stretched endlessly, its trees whispering with the wind. The silence now was not empty, it was peaceful. Lydia came running across the lawn, her shoes thumping against the wood as she bounded up the steps. She threw herself into his lap, her arms tightening around his neck. "Bonus, Dad," she said with a grin. "What are we going to do tomorrow?" The question, so simple, nearly undid him again. For most of his life, tomorrow had meant board meetings, financial projections, and lonely evenings behind locked doors. Now it meant something altogether different. He smiled, stroking her hair, his voice low but certain. "Tomorrow we live like a family." The words hung in the air, gentle and solid, wrapping around them like a promise. Serena stood at the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, watching the two of them. Her eyes met Adrian's, and though no words were spoken, the quiet understanding passed between them. They had found something worth holding on to. In the end, Adrian's journey reminds us that family isn't always about blood or inheritance. It's about the people who stay, even when the walls around us begin to crumble. Power and wealth can fade, but the choice to open your heart and call a place home is what truly lasts. What about you? If you had to choose between legacy and love, which would you hold on to? If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one.